This and every episode of the Brewlosophy podcast is brought to you by the American Homebrewers Association, a member-driven organization that wants to help you save money on beer and brewing supplies. In addition to providing brewing resources and hosting one-of-a-kind events, the AHA offers money-saving discounts at nearly 2,000 beery destinations around the country through their Member Deals program. Join the AHA at homebrewersassociation.org and make your beer money go further. For the most part, beer consists of 4 ingredients: malt, hops, yeast, and water, which when used in varying combinations can produce a multitude of different styles ranging in color, aroma, flavor, and mouthfeel. However, there are certain styles, particularly those of a higher ABV, where these 4 ingredients alone can leave a beer feeling syrupy in the mouth. Over the years, brewers have developed a simple yet effective trick for producing strong yet dry beers. You're listening to the Brewlosophy podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this episode is contributor Matt Del Fiacco to discuss the topic of using sugar in the brewing process.
Yeah, Marshall, and I'm pretty excited about this one. It's not just high ABV beers, right? Like we see sugar in a huge range of styles, from really low American light lagers all the way up to obviously like our big imperial stouts. And we're talking about sugar in this episode really as like those kind of secondary and tertiary sugar additions that really aren't maltose derived. Like, of course, we get our sugars from the dry malt extracts or from just the malt itself. But in this episode, we're talking about things like cane sugar, honey, molasses, treacle, things that usually would make up a smaller portion of the fermentables in a beer, but certainly show up in just a huge range of styles and show up in like a huge range of expression.
Yeah, right. I remember kits back in the day. I never actually brewed one of these kits, but I think it was my brother who bought a kit, and his first kit came with like a bag of corn sugar or dextrose. We all know that you use sugar for bottle conditioning or for carbonation in general. But the instructions that he got were to add this, and I think they called it like a booster or something like that. And the whole intent was basically just to boost your ABV without adding any other characteristics to your beer. And yeah, you're right. Sugar isn't just for those big high ABV Belgian beers or whatever it is. You see American light lager recipes that have a bit of sugar in it just to drive that ABV up a little bit without contributing any flavor.
Yeah, and there's so many secondary effects of adding sugar. It's actually really interesting. I was reading through Brew Like a Monk the other day, and they were talking with some brewers about sugar. And one of the things that they noted was one of the brewers felt that home brewers, particularly, specifically American home brewers, are kind of afraid of sugar, or don't treat sugar as like a proper part of the brewing process,
right,
or maybe
it's
not like that. Like maybe you add this sugar, like it's going to be detrimental to your yeast, it's going to thin your beer out too much. All these things.
Yeah. That is such a trend. I mean, there's a lot of poo-pooing the use, I think so too, non-maltose sugars in the brewing process. And, I think a part of that has to do with the fact that, there's something romantic about producing your own sugar from malt, right? And sticking with just those 4 ingredients. I mean, as much as we like to think that we're, rogue and we do what we want to do with brewing, the Reinheitsgebot really has influenced us. I know it has me. My favorite beers are those that are made with those 4 particular ingredients, but we'll dig a little bit more into some of the, kind of the common, I think, complaints out there about what sugar can do to beer and whatnot a bit in the show. But first, I want to thank everybody who's remembered to use the links over at brewlosophy.com/support. When they're shopping online, every little bit helps us to continue bringing you this show. If you'd be so kind as to bookmark and use them when you do your shopping, we'd really appreciate it. Again, they can be found at brewlosophy.com/support. If you want to be rewarded for your support, you can become a patron of Brewlosophy by pledging a small monthly contribution. In return, you'll receive things like access to the Brew Crew private forum, never before published recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A with a special guest. Just a couple of days ago, New England IPA expert Scott Janish joined us from Norway and answered patrons' questions for an hour. It was so good. Coming up next month, which you've still got time to get in on, are the yeast wranglers from Imperial Yeast. Super cool folks who I'm excited to have join us. And in future months, we've got other great guests, including, get this, Russian River's Vinny Chilurzo. What? That's right. He's going to be on answering all of your questions, I'm sure, about how to make incredible hoppy IPA and sour beers and whatnot. So to learn more about how you can be rewarded for helping us to bring you this content, head over to patreon.com/brewlosophy. Now, as most of you are surely aware at this point, HomebrewCon is right around the corner. We've been talking about it incessantly, and we couldn't be more excited about it. Our booth with Yakima Valley hops, Imperial Organic Yeast, and Mecca Great Estate Malt is basically just going to be a big, fun party. So be sure to stop by if you're attending the conference. Matt?
It is my favorite event of the year. It's going to be tons of fun. Just getting together with everyone is always the greatest. And I'm going to do a short promo. Marshall, Chino, and I are going to be having just our talk about brewing faster and thinking about how modern processes and modern developments in brewing technology and maybe just questioning some of that conventional knowledge is can make brewing a faster and more enjoyable process.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a fun talk. It's going to be, we're doing our talk, I believe it's, on Friday at like 2 o'clock in the afternoon, something like that.
Yep, believe so.
Yeah, it's going to be a fun one. And I'm not sure, we're still talking about whether we're going to have beers there or not. I believe we got a slot that doesn't really have beer involved. But the nice thing is if you come to our talk, right afterwards, you can come over to our booth and we will have beer over there. So, and it may very well be beer that was made using the methods that we discuss in the talk. So, we do also still have some spots open on the guest list for our karaoke bash, which is going to be a ton of fun. We'd love for you to join us there. If you're interested, you can email me, Marshall@brewlosophy.com, and I'll shoot you details on how you can make a donation to secure your spot. We didn't want to charge for this thing, but it's also not a free event. So all you have to do is just make a donation, whatever works for you, and we'll get you on the guest list. Whatever spots aren't filled, and they are filling up fast, will be open to people who decide last minute at the conference that they want to go. That's going to be Thursday night from 9 p.m. to 1 a.m. in the morning. You don't want to miss it, I promise. Tons of fun, crazy picks, all that fun stuff. All right, we've got some feedback, which this week is brought to you by Imperial Yeast, who are providing brewers with the finest quality yeast on the market, packing 200 billion cells into each pitch-right pouch. Brewers are ensured a quick and healthy fermentation. We've all been using Imperial Yeast almost exclusively now here at Brewlosophy for about a year, and we absolutely love it. With a range of ale and lager strains, as well as some funkier stuff, Imperial Yeast is sure to have what you need to turn your wort into delicious beer. I was just talking with the folks from Imperial about collaborating on a really neat yeast that I think is gonna kick some ass. So go check out everything they have to offer at imperialyeast.com. You will love it as much as we do. All right, we continue to get feedback from our recent show on gelatin finding, which I completely expected. And this one's really good. It comes from Will Fortson in Atlanta, Georgia, who wrote in to say, I brew a lot of New England IPA and typically use Yeast 1318. That's the London Ale 3, White Labs WLP 644, and WLP 008, as well as Safel SO4. Those are all very common New England IPA yeasts, I believe. So he says, I find with all of my yeast choices that even with full attenuation and extended cold crashing, I was always getting what other brewers and lovers of the style refer to as yeast burn for a couple of weeks after kegging. I compare it to an almost mild capsicum kind of effect on the back of the tongue and in the throat. Capsicum is the heating compound in like peppers and whatnot. He says, I could only associate this with yeast cells hung in suspension that were taking several weeks to precipitate out when I began fining with gelatin just prior to cold crashing in primary. That's right. He is admitting to fining his NEIPAs with gelatin. He says he noticed immediately that this burn was no longer present. He says, my NEIPAs weren't necessarily less hazy to any great degree, but this flaw that required 2 or more weeks to age out was gone entirely. I wonder if that's what's meant when brewers say that gelatin fining creates the potential for more rapid aging. I notice no difference in the freshness of my hop aromas or flavors or any accelerated degradation to the quality of the beers fined with gelatin. They're simply less flawed by yeast in suspension and therefore more drinkable at an earlier stage. Whoa, there's so much we can talk about with this, Matt.
That's a lot to chew on. Man, I mean, so my initial reaction is obviously, I think the most interesting part of that for me was the equation of that progression from yeast, like having that yeast burn characteristic that he mentioned, and equating that with aging. So thinking about like how I hear brewers say all the time, like, my beer is always much better, maybe a week or so in the keg. Like, it's been in the kegerator for a little while.
Totally, yeah.
It's had time to settle. It's had time to meld, and all those flavors kind of have gotten time to like get into their place. I think the theory is super interesting. I would say for sure that, like, one, if you're noticing that you're not getting that characteristic after gelatin fining, and gelatin fining is working for you in terms of you're still getting the appearance you want, then that's awesome.
Yeah,
like, that's fantastic. Like, that means you're getting great beer.
Well, in the experiment that we did with Ed Coffey at HomebrewCon 2016, where he fined any IPA with gelatin, and that was the variable, was gelatin finding in any IPA. That beer stayed hazy. The beer stayed delicious. I mean, it was still very aromatic, still very flavorful. And this comment from Phil got me thinking about what Ray, is always saying about gelatin being powdered thyme. And one of the, like you mentioned, Matt, like when you put a keg of beer in your keezer or your kegerator and you let it sit for 2 weeks, I mean, there's a reason that amount of time of cold conditioning while it's carbonating is kind of recommended. You're waiting for certain things to precipitate out, to fall out of solution, so that beer comes into its prime. My thought, and this is just a theory at this point, but or a hypothesis really, but my thought has always been with gelatin that all it's doing is it's expediting that precipitation and falling out process. That it's allowing your beer, just like Ray says, it's allowing your beer to come into its prime, a week or two sooner than it might without that fining. And that could be the case for all of the types of post-fermentation or I guess fermentation findings in the case of Clarity Firm. And so I really appreciate what Phil's saying about, now I've never heard of yeast burn. I've heard of yeast bite, but I've heard of hop burn. And what he is describing sounds like this concept of hop burn that I've heard from guys like Ed Coffey and whatnot. I mean, if using gelatin removes that quote unquote flaw quicker and your beer is staying delicious, I see no reason not to use it in that case, even if your intent isn't to clarify the beer. I mean, that's what it looks like. When we test this out, all of the negative comments we get are always about trying to make a hazy style not look hazy. But what if the use of gelatin actually makes the beer better quicker and it doesn't take away that haze? I think it's an interesting idea.
I agree. And one of the things that I've been talking with Jake about more recently is the fact that all the mineral experiments have come back, like large water experiments have largely come back significant. Yeah. And so thinking about like all the particle matter in our beers, all the little bits of haziness, all the things, it's entirely possible that those things influence the beer in some way beyond just looking different. Sure. And so if you have that gelatin and it's dropping out certain compounds or it's speeding up the precipitation of those compounds, then more money to you, man. That's awesome. I'm pumped.
Yeah. There's part of me now just wants to start gelatin finding all of my NE IPAs, sort of knowing that it's not gonna drop clear, at least with gelatin alone. So anyways, great feedback. Thank you so much, Phil. If you have any show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com, or you can phone it in by calling 951-444-0320. Again, that's 951-444-0320. So a while back, I was contacted by someone who shares our love of beer experimentation. His name also happens to be Phil. His last name is Rusher, though. So Phil Rusher told me that he'd been messing around with some of the variables that we've tested in his own brewing. And so I asked him, we got into a conversation about all the stuff that he was doing, and he offered to send me a couple of beers that he'd made, one of which arrived with nothing on the label but a couple of question marks.
1 minute beer review with Jersey and Tim. I can already tell that somebody should have used gelatin.
It's a dirty glass, Jersey.
Oh, is it? No, I've learned the finer points of gelatin fining.
Yeah, that'll work. What do you think?
I like it a lot.
It's very easy drinking.
Ah, look who's new to the beer review.
Thank you for inviting me in, guys.
No, you are persona non grata.
It is easy.
He already knows what it is. Don't forget that.
I actually don't know what these are.
I was watching him pour with his eyes shut.
It's delicious.
It's good.
It's good.
There's like a fruitiness to it at the end.
I don't know. I would just drink it.
Maybe that was a dumb idea. No, there's no fruitiness. That was a test. Both of you passed. I like it.
Nothing's jumping out at me.
Well, that's why we like it. Basically, what we like is beers that have no taste, flavor, or...
Give me Coors Light!
You know what I really like about it is it doesn't taste like anything. That's amazing.
I don't have to sit there and think about the awful beer I was just drinking.
Do you guys get a toasted white bread
thing from it?
Absolutely not. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard.
Yeah, I don't either.
Do you guys happen to get the sweat that runs down an alligator's back?
Did you say toes again?
At the end, there's like a little fruitiness. Either way, I like it. I drink it. We just drank them down. Beer. Usually if we talk more than we drink, and we didn't. We drank more than we talked. If you kill our conversation, you got a pretty tasty beverage.
It's good.
Well done.
Tim, what do you think, dude? What do you taste in this beer?
Honestly, just a good tasting beer. A little piney about it for me.
Bullshit.
It is. It's
piney.
good.
There's not a pine in there.
I didn't say there was. It's just kind of what I'm referring it to.
Describe to me how one acquires a flavor where you can identify pine.
From the smell of like a pine tree. It's just,
so you assume the taste?
Yeah.
All right. No, I don't taste any pine. I taste a little bit of fruit at the end.
I'm not getting any fruit.
Fruit versus pine. Victor is the real learned man.
The only thing that came with this beer
Was a sense of regret?
was 3 question marks.
That's very
I think
good.
it's great.
I thought it was delicious. Do the reveal.
I don't know what it is on this one.
What do you get out of it?
It's a Pilsner with a...
I thought I tasted some question marks.
That's good. I liked it.
It was very good.
Immediately after the review, I shot Phil an email in a moderately buzzed state, admittedly, to ask what the beer was because I had no clue. To my palate, it tasted sort of like a fresh lager, which I prefer. I don't like old beer, basically. It wasn't bright in clarity, but it certainly wasn't hazy. So that kind of gave away that maybe it was fresher, but it tasted like a lager. I'm pretty sure he bottled the beer off the keg, anyways. So I didn't get any pine like Tim did. I did get maybe a little bit of like fruitiness in the finish from hops. It wasn't esters. But it was more floral to me. The hop character was more floral. And yes, I did actually get some toasty white bread flavors in the finish. It was a really well done, simple, easy drinking beer. It seems like we're getting a lot of these types of beers to review lately, but good job, Phil. What he ended up telling me was that it was like a Bavarian lager that he'd thrown together the month before. So it was really fresh. Really good beer. Something that I would sit and crush while I'm sitting poolside anytime. So thanks again, Phil. If you want your beer or any other fermented beverage that you make reviewed on the show, feel free to shoot me an email, marshall@brewlosophy.com, and we will get you all set up. Also, if you live anywhere near any of us, we'd love to get you involved as a participant in our experiments and all the other weird stuff we do. We've got contributors in Chicago, Illinois, Denver, Colorado, Pueblo, Colorado, Corona, California, Atlanta, Georgia, and right here in Fresno, California. Again, just shoot me an email, marshall@brewlosophy.com, and I will connect you with the contributor closest to you. We will be right back after this short break. When dumping wort-soaked grain and leftover low-gravity wort while cleaning up after a brew day, do you ever wonder what your true efficiency would be if that wort made its way to the kettle instead? Using the brew bag, a fabric filter for all mash tuns and brewing methods, allows you to capture every last drop of wort. Not only does this increase kettle efficiency, it lowers your grain bill, which saves you money. Throwing wort in the trash is like dumping a 12-pack down the drain and just doesn't make sense. Use the brew bag and leave no wort behind. I've been using these filters for a long time and recommend them to everyone. I never have to worry about a stuck sparge and cleanup is fast and easy. Go grab yourself a brew bag fabric filter at brewinabag.com and be sure to use code TBP17 at checkout to get a discount on your order. Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD. That's BRUPOD at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort, from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature, in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com. And be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. Sugar's typically used in the brewing process to drive up ABV without influencing aroma, flavor, and especially mouthfeel, at least in my experience. While its use goes against certain strict regional brewing laws, my understanding is that it's been used for a while in other areas of the world.
Yeah, it has. It actually has a really long history. And just to reiterate something I mentioned earlier, in this episode, we're talking about sugar primarily as, secondary sugar additions or just additional fermentables that aren't derived from malt or aren't derived from, the all grain part of the process. Those things are like maltose, obviously a sugar. Sugar is one of the key components of beer in that capacity. But I want to focus more on like the dextrose, the glucose, the sucrose, those kinds of things.
Stuff that we might refer to as like adjunct sugars, right?
Exactly. And it's actually pretty interesting that you bring up the German purity law, because sugar has found its place in purity laws all over the world, historically speaking. Sugar's been used for an incredibly long time, and it's really unclear how long, just because obviously brewing is such an old process, and sugar itself has been, this isn't necessarily like black patent malt where that was something we can kind of trace back a little bit. Right. Sugar's been around for an incredibly long time. Humans have, for a very long time, we've had secondary sugar sources, and for probably about just as long, that has been involved in our alcohol production.
Yeah. I mean, not Americans. I think human beings in general love their alcohol, and I have to imagine that long before brewing, brewing is a complicated, convoluted process. You have to have malted grains. It can't just be grains,
Right.
And in order to extract that maltose, it has to, you have to steep it. It has to go through the mash, all of this stuff. Sugar's easy. I mean, I'd imagine that, you got people like rum makers in the Caribbean and whatnot, and that sugar has been fermented. Just straight, simple sugars have been fermented for a lot longer than beer's been being made.
Definitely. So I do want to, even though we don't necessarily know, originally when did sugar start getting used, we do definitely have some historical context in terms of how sugar has found its way into the brewing process. And one of the most famous ways of that happening is actually in England. At the very least, sugar was used at least as early as the early 1900s. Burnt sugars were used in the early 1800s to make porters. And we talked about that a little bit in the roasted malt episode where, black patent came around after sugar was banned from brewing. That was one of the purity laws that was in place, is that you can't use sugars. So that burnt sugar coloring that was coloring the porters darker, they needed a new way to make darker beers. So really interesting, like sugar, and especially in the form of invert sugar, in English milds and styles similar to that, really heavy use in the historical examples of those styles.
Yeah, that's so interesting that like my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that a lot of these the bans in brewing, so like we're banning you from using sugar, had mostly to do with taxation, right?
Yeah, absolutely. A great example of that is actually there was a proposed purity law in New South Wales in Australia, and this was in the early 1830s. It's in an article that I just read the other day by Dr. Brett Stubbs. And he mentions that, they wanted to ban the use of sugar in brewing primarily so that they would encourage the growth of barley on the continent. They wanted they were like, hey, let's force people to get their sugar for alcohol from somewhere else, and we'll grow more barley, and that's overall going to be beneficial. So it's very heavily related to those taxations and to those laws for sure.
Well, so the use of sugar in beer, which is the real reason we're here today, there's all kinds of different types of sugar that we use. You mentioned invert. I think, a lot of people are kind of confused as to what exactly invert sugar is compared to other types, as well as all of the other kinds of sugars that we use in brewing.
As far as like sugars that are typically used, obviously we have things like table sugar. We find things like brown sugar, molasses, treacle, malt sugars, just things derived from different malts, candy sugar, maple syrup, tons of different kinds. And really, the difference in some of those is typically what that sugar is derived from. So fruit sugars, fructose, would be derived from fruits, or they'd be found in certain compounds. Like, for example, maple sugar has a degree of fructose in it. And then obviously we have things on the other end of it. And the great example is corn sugar, which is it's about 5% moisture, and then otherwise is about 100% fermentable. So it really comes down to where those sugars are derived from, and then what kind of processing they go through.
Right. And there's and just to hit on some of where this stuff comes from, I think it's pretty interesting. Typical table sugar, people will, and which is completely usable in brewing, by the way. I actually just made I made a Belgian blonde ale where I used a full pound of, typical, the cheap table sugar. There's two general sources for table sugar. One is cane sugar. So you're getting that from the canes, that's like C&H, the popular one. But the cheaper stuff typically comes from a potato or right. It's like,
beets?
Beets. Yeah. Not a potato. There is potato sugar out there.
There is potato sugar, but beet sugar. Yeah.
Yeah, sugar beets. I actually used to live next to a sugar beet factory when I was in Nampa, Idaho for a couple of years. Boy, does that not smell good. So you got sugar beets, you got sugar cane, and that's your typical table sugar. Brown sugar is just it's another version of both of those that it's not bleached, but then it also doesn't have what ends up being molasses removed from it, if I'm not mistaken.
Nope, you are correct.
And then I have no clue what treacle is. What's treacle?
So treacle is essentially a darker molasses.
Oh, okay.
Molasses actually has a couple different different types. Like you can have a lighter molasses, you can have a darker molasses, and when you have treacle, it's a very dark molasses.
Okay, that's interesting. Now, my understanding, my understanding of this comes purely from like what I've read online. Treacle seems to be more commonly used in like English styles, maybe. I've never actually seen it on the shelves here in the States.
Definitely. It is for sure. And essentially, like you'll see that just because treacle, I believe, is actually just what in the UK molasses is called.
Oh, okay.
And so there's that. But also, like obviously, when we're using the word treacle, we're talking about a really dark molasses. And you'll see a lot of that actually in styles like Old Ale, where it's really appropriate, where you want some of those characteristics. So it absolutely has a place in brewing, and I think there's just such a great context for it. It's something I want to explore more.
Yeah. I've never used treacle or molasses in brewing. What I have used, though, are these like Belgian candy sugars or Belgian candy syrups, which I know this is where kind of that invert discussion can come into play. Let's talk a little bit about the difference between, what is like candy sugar and candy syrup, and then invert sugars.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that's something that we see a misconception about online all the time. So candy syrup and candy sugar are actually they're the same product. Candy sugar is what we'll typically refer to as like the solids. And it is essentially a sugar solution that has undergone the Maillard reaction. It has been boiled, gets darker, and contributes different characters just based on the severity of that reaction. So candy syrup and candy sugar, same thing, different types of the same product.
Right. So candy, if I'm not mistaken, and this might just be a semantic thing, but candy sugar is like rock candy. It looks like rock candy, right? Like
that is exactly it.
And you can just toss them in. We're going to talk about how these sugars get used in a minute, but you can basically just toss those things in the boil. They dissolve, whatever it is. Whereas candy syrup obviously is a syrup. Now, what to me, what I think gets confused a lot and kind of mistakenly discussed online, at least, is the difference between like a Belgian candy syrup and an invert syrup.
Yes, exactly. And so an invert syrup is a sugar solution that has had something like cream of tartar or lemon juice sometimes added to it, and then undergoes that same reaction process. And it's actually inverted sugar where that inversion process has taken place, as opposed to the candy syrup, which is really just a darker sugar solution that's undergone a Maillard reaction.
Right.
And I believe that in the invert syrups, the Maillard reaction actually takes place more effectively.
So my understanding about invert sugar it still confuses me is that that you've got both glucose and fructose that are formed. This is okay. Wikipedia says by the hydrolysis of sucrose. My understanding, though, like you said, is it requires the addition of some form of an acid or something like that, and it creates this really thick goopy stuff that is said to, I think, like get into the wort better or whatever it is. But people use invert sugar. I very rarely use sugar in my brewing, but there is a difference. Just put it out there this way: there's a difference between invert sugar and your typical Belgian candy syrup. It is treated differently.
Yes, and it's definitely also something that, based on how darker those sugars get and what sugar you're using, they're going to contribute different things to your beer.
Yeah, and exactly. And the different colors of how dark the syrups and the sugars that you're using are they are used specifically for the contribution of flavor and aroma and whatnot that it has on your beer. Same thing with things like maple syrup and honey. Maple syrup, it's maple syrup. You can actually use things like our contributor Brian Hall up in Anchorage is collecting birch sap right now, and he's going to make birch syrup that I'm sure he'll use in some beers. And the level of or how dark those syrups get are going to have some sort of an impact on your beer. My brother once made a really tasty brown ale that he used quite a bit of really fresh. He lives up in Buffalo, New York, and they have maple syrup farms around there. And so he got some fresh maple syrup for that, and it was absolutely delicious. You could definitely taste the maple in that beer. Honey is another popular one. You got if you're using just straight honey, you've got mead. It's highly fermentable, as are most of these sugars.
So most of these sugars are definitely highly fermentable, and that range is actually going to contribute to how what comes through in your beer. So, for example, like if you're going to add something like table sugar or just straight sucrose to your beer, that's essentially 100% fermentable. When you put that into your beer, that means that you're contributing a really simple sugar that the yeast is going to be able to, it's going to really be simple for the yeast to just consume it in its entirety.
Just go to town on it.
Yeah, exactly. So that beer is going to end up with more alcohol. It's going to finish at a lower gravity, compared to a similar OG that's all malt.
Right.
It's going to have a lighter body because of that, and then you're not going to get any color contribution from that sugar or any flavor contribution really, besides the lightening of that body and the higher alcohol.
Right.
You contrast that with something like molasses or something like treacle, one of those darker sugars we mentioned, which is typically composed of like sucrose, glucose, fructose in different amounts, and due to its production, which it's ultimately less fermentable than something like table sugar.
Right.
So when you add that to your beer, you are still going to get that additional alcohol production because these are all very highly fermentable. So you'll get that alcohol production, that lighter body, and that lower final gravity. But you're also going to be introducing color to your beer. You're going to introduce some sugars that won't ferment out, and they're going to contribute some overall flavors and characteristics to the beer.
Right. Largely desirable when used in certain amounts in certain styles of beer.
Definitely.
I think the styles of beer that come to my mind, and I've already kind of mentioned it, are Belgian beers. If you're making a double. Most recipes I see require some form of a medium to dark sugar, some sort of a Belgian candy syrup or something like that. And I've made a couple myself, and you definitely, the characteristic, you get that dryness, when you use those sugars with all the flavors that you're looking for as well. So sugar definitely has its place in beer. And we've talked a lot about the different types of sugars, but there's also varying ways in which these sugars get used.
Absolutely. And so like we just briefly touched on the fact that what we said was like that it'll ferment out, right? That like those fermentable sugars are going to get consumed by the yeast. They're not going to leave much else behind. And people experiment with ways for a variety of different reasons to add that sugar, not only just to try to retain more of those characteristics from the initial charge of sugar, of adjunct sugar, but also to try to stave off some of the risks of having a higher gravity, and also of having a higher gravity for an ale or a lager yeast that doesn't contain the nutrients and doesn't contain the right environment for that yeast.
Right. Yeah. It's pretty well known that when we're tossing yeast into a really high OG wort in particular, or, we're not tossing enough yeast in or whatever it might be, that we're hoping that these yeast do for us what we expect, but we're putting them into a pretty harsh environment. And so brewers over the eons here have developed different methods for using it. I think probably one of the more common ways is once you get that sweet wort out of your mash and put it into the boil kettle, is incorporating your sugars directly into the boil.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of benefits to that. Not obviously it's quick, it's simple.
It's easy. Yeah, right.
It's so easy to do. You can pretty much be assured that sugar is going to be dissolved really evenly with the wort. That's always really a huge benefit as opposed to worrying about, dumping a bunch of honey into a partially fermented beer. And then sanitation, if you do it during the boil, you don't need to worry about any natural organisms that may be in that sugar, or anything else, maybe throwing off your yeast or producing an off flavor. So
yeah, right.
Definitely some benefits to it.
Right. But the big issue with putting it into the boil is, my thought has always been if after adding that sugar, my OG is going to be higher than about 1070, which is something you can do without adding any sugar. That's an easy, we make IPAs all day long with no sugar in them. But if the addition of that sugar is going to top my OG, take it over 1070 OG or so, that's you run the risk of shocking your yeast, and which could lead to poor attenuation, maybe even a stalled fermentation. So brewers have come up with some pretty interesting ways to incorporate sugar later on down the line.
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense because, like you said, the osmotic shock, the osmotic pressure can definitely introduce some problems. So, and especially there are some yeasts, reportedly, that are more prone to stalling than others. So, like you said, people have developed some great ways of just trying to get around this. And some of what I see frequently is adding that sugar during fermentation, whether that's at high Krausen, whether it is, just maybe towards in a secondary, allowing it to do it again. Some people I know are advocates that adding sugar during the packaging process could actually could solve some of this problem while still contributing flavor. I'm a little more skeptical of that one, but it's out there.
Well, I know people like that maple brown beer that my brother sent me. He actually bottle conditioned it with maple syrup. So maybe that's where the maple flavor came from. I mean, that's kind of an interesting idea.
Yeah, definitely. It's one that it's one I'm going to run by you sometime. I'm pretty interested in that one in terms of testing it out. But
yeah,
I mean, the theory behind all of those is that you're letting the yeast, after that initial pitch, you're pitching it into a lower gravity environment. You're pitching it into an environment that's derived largely of malt sugars and nutrients that yeast needs. And you're letting it become healthier and more plentiful in that environment. And then when you do end up adding your sugar, whether that's as a single addition, you just do all the sugar, or whether you do that over the course of a couple days, you're letting that, you're only bringing up that the gravity in that solution so much, right? It's never going to be what it was if you had done it all in the boil.
Right. It's sort of like you're coaxing the yeast. You're feeding it. It's like giving the marathon runner water every 4 or 5 miles, as opposed to making them drink 2 gallons before they hit the course.
Yep.
And it makes sense. It makes sense to me. There's 2 ways that I've heard of people doing this. One is to incorporate all of your sugar in a single dose, and another one is to stagger your additions. And what that looks like, I've never done this one. I've never actually added sugar to a fermenting beer, but I tend to drink low ABV beers because I like to drink a lot. So anyways, a staggered sugar addition is exactly how it sounds. You go 4 days into fermentation, you add 1 dose, maybe it's 25%. The following day you add another 25%, and then on the 3rd day maybe you add the rest, or another. And you just spread it out over a few days of fermentation so that yeast is constantly working, and you're treating it like a little baby, and
exactly.
it does its job without so much stress.
Yep, and ideally that means that you won't have a stalled fermentation, especially in some of those Belgian beers. You'll make sure that your attenuation ends up really good and that you have a low final gravity. And really, it's a great method of trying to mitigate some of those effects from the boil. But it has its own cons. Obviously, if you're adding something like natural honeys, you need to worry about the contribution that's making to the solution. It maybe not so much of a risk. It's the yeast is already pretty well established in that beer, but still a possibility. And then you are still introducing a degree of osmotic shock, especially if you do go with the single sugar addition.
Right.
You're really, really quickly changing the gravity of that solution. But that said, I'm a little skeptical of it. We'll see. I'm not so sure that it makes too much of a difference.
Well, I'm going to keep going with I feel like I made a good analogy here with the marathon thing. So
sure.
I think of this one as like, oh, I signed up for a 5K, and then when I see the finish line, someone's like moves it and is like, nope, you got to run a marathon now. Like that to me, and that would you're like, oh shit, I got to do this thing, and yeast are living organisms that tire out, they exhaust,
sure.
And so I love that brewers, it's a really clever way to kind of like, get what it is we're looking for out of beer and out of fermentation. And we've come up with these ways. One final method that I've heard some people talking about involves adding the sugar basically at the end of fermentation. So once the yeast have done their original work, we kind of give them something new to do.
Yeah, and that's one that you'll either see, sometimes people add that in like a secondary fermenter. Others I've actually heard one really cool one I've seen with some Belgians lately is that they'll actually rack into a serving keg and add all of the sugar they'd want to add, and then towards the end of that, hook up a spunding valve and use that last bit of sugar for carbonation. So it's a pretty clever way, and definitely then you have already a dry beer. You're going to help that yeast. That yeast is it's not competing with much, so it's going to be able to consume that sugar quickly. Definitely some benefits to it. With the added con that as the beer is finishing fermenting, the yeast is starting to drop more out of solution, and you want to make sure that there's enough yeast in the solution to actually process all that sugar.
Right.
So definitely some pros and cons to all of it, and it's just wild how many ways we've come up with to try to think about just making better beer, making sugar, using sugar more effectively.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we've done some experiments as we are wont to do, and when we get back from this break, results from those. Shopping for brewing supplies online can be a real hassle, which is why we recommend Love to Brew. They've got great prices, super fast shipping, and they carry exclusive products like East Coast Yeast, the Brewer's Essentials brand, and their award-winning beer recipe kits. They're also the only place you can pick up your very own Brewlosophy recipe kit. The numbers don't lie. Love to Brew has hundreds of 5-star reviews, and thousands of brewers are choosing them for their supplies and ingredients each year. Experience the difference at lovetobrew.com. That's love, the number 2, brew.com.
Compact and simple to use with a small footprint for brewing indoors, the Grainfather makes it easy for you to brew professional quality beers at home. The Grainfather is an all-in-one brewing system that lets you brew all grain beer in a single compact stainless steel unit. It uses an electric heating element and pump to maintain a constant temperature and to circulate the wort during the mashing and cooling stages. It also comes with a counterflow chiller to reduce chilling times and produce high-quality wort. And now, with the addition of their conical fermenter, the Grainfather takes things one step further by offering homebrewers state-of-the-art temperature-controlled fermentation just like commercial breweries use. And with the Grainfather Recipe Creator and Connect app, you can easily design a recipe, sync your brewing system with your phone, and then just sit back and relax as the app takes over and assures that you maintain your scheduled mash temps and boil schedule. Head to Grainfather.com to purchase your all-in-one brewing system today and to sign up for their free recipe creator tool. Once more, head on over to Grainfather.com, that's Grainfather.com, and get started today.
Founded in 1978 by brewing pioneer Charlie Papazian, the American Homebrewers Association is a division of the Brewers Association focused specifically on protecting and promoting the hobby of homebrewing. In addition to their work lobbying for the rights of homebrewers across the country, they're also the primary sponsor of Brewlosophy.com. By joining the AHA, not only are you supporting their cause, but you get a ton of benefits as well. Discounts at breweries across the U.S., early access to tickets for events like the Great American Beer Festival, and you get to attend HomebrewCon, the world's biggest gathering of homebrewers. Head over to Brewlosophy.com/AHA now to sign up to become a member. So as we were talking about at the end of the last segment, there are various ways brewers can incorporate sugar into the brewing process. Certain points during the process and different ways, whether they're going to stagger it or do a single dose. And one of our contributors, Malcolm Fraser, was interested in this idea of a single dose versus a staggered addition when the sugar is being added during the fermentation process. So he put it to the test. Malcolm brewed up a Belgian Golden Strong Ale, and single 10-gallon batch, split it between two fermenters, and then he either added a single dose of sugar or staggered them. And I believe also he used some nutrients.
Yep, Malcolm ended up using some nutrients for his as well. That cane and beet sugar was a grand total of about 14% of his grist. And he fermented
no small amount, right? I mean, that's a lot of sugar.
It is. It's a ton of sugar, and it's fairly standard for the style. Definitely in a Belgian Golden Strong Ale, you'd see anywhere from 15 to 20. I've heard some reports of 30% of those fermentables coming just from a very, very light sugar addition. We're not even talking about something like a D60 or a D160 or any kind of really dark sugar like a molasses.
He just used your basic table sugar, cane or beet sugar, I believe is what it was. Like the cheap stuff you can get off the shelf at the dollar store.
Yeah. So he ended up with a beer that was about 1064 OG prior to the addition of the sugar. It was a single batch. It was split between two carboys, which I always love to see in some of these experiments because it kind of, you get a little more consistency between that initial volume. And it was staggered, was split into 3 additions. He did an addition at 24 hours, a second addition at 24 hours, and then a third addition an additional 24 hours later. So over
3 days.
Yep.
Yeah, over the course of 3 days, he made the same sized addition of sugar, whereas for the single dose batch, he just added all of the sugar at the end. Was it at the end of the boil?
It was. So it was right after that the wort had been split between those fermenters.
Right.
Yep. So some interesting notes. The single dose beer actually fermented 0.001 lower than the standard staggered batch.
That doesn't concern me too much. I mean, come on. It's just one specific gravity point. You're not going to be able to taste that.
I agree, but the point that I love there is that there was not a stuck fermentation. And that's one of the things that, one of the concerns is that by doing that staggered, you're alleviating some of that, risk in having a stuck fermentation. It didn't seem to make a difference here.
Yeah, no, and that's one of the big arguments about, for those who advocate doing staggered additions. The idea is you're not shocking the yeast. One of the other things though that I've heard about and we haven't touched too much on is that when you shock yeast, when you stress those yeast out, they are purportedly more likely to produce certain types of flavors, not necessarily off flavors, but they can be. And that might be, increase in esters or phenols. One of the nice things about these Belgian ales is that those yeasts are very characterful in the first place. So that may or may not be a bad thing.
Yeah, definitely.
So no stuck fermentation. The staggered batch did end 0.001 SG higher than the single dose fermented batch, but the beers otherwise ended up looking the same at the end. They weren't terribly different, and everything was looking good before he went and collected data from 37 participants. Nice big pool of participants. With that number of participants, he would have needed to get 18. Well, 18 of the participants would have needed to correctly identify the unique sample in the triangle test. And in the end, just 16 got it right. 16 people were able to pick the odd beer out, which I think, kind of goes to show that perhaps, at least for this style and in this specific incident, the staggered sugar addition didn't really make much of a difference from just throwing all of the sugar in right after the boil.
Yeah, it definitely seems to suggest that in this beer, that wasn't a problem. Of those 16 people, preference was split down the middle. So even let's say theoretically that it did end up making a discernible difference, which in this experiment obviously it didn't. People didn't tend to prefer one or the other. There wasn't really a lot of consistency between which one people thought was better.
Right. Well, and just a note on the preference thing, and I get I get told that it comes up often that I don't like this preference question, and I don't.
I know.
But on experiments, this is kind of a technicality. When an experiment fails to achieve significance, that preference question is ultimately meaningless, right? Because basically what we end up doing is we ask people to compare two beers that if they didn't get it right on the triangle test, those two beers are the same, and you still get people choosing a preference, right? We only report the preference ratings of those people who got it right, but if we failed to achieve significance, that suggests that there really isn't a big difference there, so the preference ratings don't really matter, and that's probably why we see so many of the non-significant experiments returning preference ratings that are split almost exactly down the middle. It's basically a random pick.
That's an interesting point. Yeah, definitely.
Well, Malcolm tasted these beers, and I don't think he was able to tell them apart right off the bat. He did say that over time that he thought he might be able to detect a difference, but that it wasn't huge. Certainly not big enough for him to choose one method over another.
Yeah, absolutely. And Malcolm even closed that his natural inclination was to start going back to just single additions of sugar.
Yeah, because it's easier, right? I mean, it's not that adding sugar over 3 days is all that difficult, but one of my concerns with doing that, if I were to do that, the first thing that comes to my mind is every time I take that freaking top off of my fermenter, I'm afraid that a fruit fly might get in there or oxygen's going to come into contact with my beer. There's all kinds of issues that come with making additions or taking a whole bunch of finishing gravity or gravity, hydrometer measurements. I like to leave my beer alone until it's done as much as I possibly can. So, I think this was cool and kind of gives some credence to the idea that you can just throw your sugar in, at least on a beer that. Actually, what was the OG after when we account for the sugar addition? I think it was somewhere up in the 1076 or something like that.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah, 1076 to 1080, something like that. It's kind of hard to predict that, but so yeah, that's not terribly high, but still, I would have expected a difference in there, and there didn't seem to be a big one in this one. So I thought it was interesting. Matt, you went along and did an experiment on another method of adding sugar to beer. But before we get to that, I want to tell everyone about our sponsor, Brewers Hardware, who specialize in triclover compatible sanitary fittings, conical fermenters, kettles, and brew stands. Brewers Hardware offers a variety of unique and hard-to-find items for both the home and craft brewing markets, including high-quality stainless fittings at competitive prices and very fast shipping. They're really excited to announce the release of the BCS 482 control system, which provides everything needed to fully automate your brewery. Learn more about this and other great gear they offer at brewershardware.com. And don't forget to mention Brewlosophy at checkout to receive a free gift. That's brewershardware.com. Matt, you were curious to compare what beers where sugar was added either during the boil or during fermentation.
Yes, exactly. So basically, I wanted to put to test that idea that, that initial high gravity environment versus one where, the yeast has had time to go through its lag and growth phase. It's healthier, it's more plentiful, it's going to consume those sugars maybe a little in a better environment, and it won't necessarily throw off the yeast or stress the yeast too much.
Tell me the truth, Matt. So when you were thinking about this experiment, did a part of you in it? And I think good science is driven by skepticism. Did you kind of question the results of Malcolm's experiment?
Absolutely. Because full disclosure, Belgian Golden Strong Ale, it's one of my favorite styles of beer. It's one of the only styles of beer that my wife will drink. And so
she likes the big stuff, huh? Jeez.
I'm fairly well associated with the style, and I'm also a big believer in big beers. You drink a lot of low ABV stuff. I'm definitely a big beer drinker, and I had always advocated, especially in the use of like molasses in like porters and stuff, of adding that during fermentation because you didn't want to stress out the yeast.
Right. It makes sense, right? Yeah, based on what we know about yeast. So you designed this experiment to test it out.
Exactly. I also ended up making a Belgian Golden Strong Ale, and for this one, I ended up using about 7% of my total fermentables coming from Golden Light candy syrup. One batch had that candy syrup added in the last 10 minutes of the boil. The other had it added at high Krausen, which was about 2 days after pitching I had really active fermentation. I was using the Gnome yeast from Imperial Organic, fermenting it at about 64, so 64 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 18 degrees Celsius. And both of the beers had a pretty high starting OG. Like the one that had the candy syrup added to the boil, had my intended OG of 1082, and then the batch that had it added during Krausen was about 1075. So
at yeast pitch, those were the specific gravities of each wort. But ostensibly that 1075 beer. It was 1082 once you added the candy syrup during fermentation. I mean, that's kind of you can't really measure it very well at that point.
That'd be kind of like the calculated overall gravity. Like if I were to report the OG, I would report it as 1082. But the nice thing about in theory, right? The nice thing about those sugar additions later is that your OG would never get that high. You'd always be able to serve it in a lower gravity environment. But yeah, I would report it as 1082. Fermented 64, Krausen 2 days later, and then both of those fermented down to the exact same final gravity of 1008, which is low. I think I'd like it lower, but it was fairly low. It went really well.
1008 from 1082. I mean
it is low, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, but that's the whole point of using these simple sugars and syrups, right? Is to really drive that attenuation.
Definitely, and it leaves your beer a little drier. Still some flavor contribution, and to be honest, the Gnome yeast just killed it. I've got a few more packs in my fridge now that I plan on using. It very, very solid Belgian yeast.
Awesome. I'm glad to hear that, actually, because I just pitched some into a Belgian Golden or a Belgian Blonde, and it smells real. I don't make many Belgians. It smells amazing. So anyways, you collected data on this from 26 participants.
I did. I was lucky enough to go to the Chaos Homebrew Club in Chicago. It was my first time there. They were awesome. 26 people ended up participating. With that sample size, 14 people would have had to identify the odd beer out in order for us to say that this was significant. Ultimately, 12 people got it, which is to say that this failed to return significance in a beer that had 7% of its fermentables derived from light candy syrup, pitched in the boil versus being added at high Krausen.
So the big difference between your experiment and Malcolm's experiment is the method. When Malcolm added the sugar to his single dose, he did it right after the boil. So it's not terribly different than you adding it 10 minutes to the end of the boil. But you didn't stagger them. You added the 7% light candy syrup at high Krausen. But sort of to my mind, when I put these two together, the essence of what I'm pulling out is maybe it doesn't make as big a difference as we thought. And my mind kind of goes back to this argument about, that we hear a lot about the quality of the ingredients that we're using nowadays. It could just be that, you built up a starter and you had such active, healthy yeast that they didn't need to be babied.
Yeah, it's entirely reasonable. And looking at these two experiments, I think there's a lot of room to argue that maybe it doesn't make as much of a big a deal. If you're pitching a starter, and obviously that's introducing a lot of oxygen into the solution, and it's healthier yeast, it's more plentiful yeast,
you mentioned oxygen, and if I'm not, correct me if I'm wrong, but you dosed both of these beers with oxygen before you pitched the yeast as well, right?
I did. They had a very good environment that they were getting into.
Right. So this is actually opening up a whole bunch of ideas for future experiments using sugar. What happens if you are the home brewer like me who's never used oxygen, but I want to make this big 1100 OG beer using sugar? Maybe if I'm not treating that wort beautifully the way that you do, maybe then it does matter. Maybe that yeast, maybe if I'm pitching a single it's 96 billion cells as opposed to 200 billion cells plus, because you're getting more than that because you're making a starter. Maybe then that staggered addition or an addition during high Krausen is going to make a difference compared to adding that sugar somewhere else, during the boil or whatever.
Yeah, definitely could. I'm not totally ready to discount this method or discount these ideas, but based off of this, I think there's so much room to explore these sugar additions and especially in different contexts. Like these are both Belgian Golden Strong ales, which I love, but I'd love to see some porters getting thrown in here or some old ales, or even an American light lager, since those are historically a lot of rice solids, or rice syrup. So
well, and the rice and corn, the use of rice and corn adjunct in American light lagers or in pretty much light, like pale, simple commercial lagers. Well, the whole idea was a cheap source of fermentables that don't taste. I mean, that really was like kind of the driving thing behind it, right?
Definitely.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned that I just brewed up a Belgian blonde ale. We're going to be publishing something about that here on brewlosophy.com soon. But just to give a little background, I don't brew with sugar very often, but I wanted to make sure that I did on this beer just because it seems kind of typical. I used 1 pound of table sugar. It was beet sugar, along with the grains to make a typical Belgian blonde ale, and I just tossed all of that in to the boil. I think somewhere around the 15-minute mark, with 15 minutes left or something. And I also used Imperial's Gnome, and it took right off. I didn't make a starter with it, but it took off, and I have a feeling that it's gonna be a pretty tasty beer. So
it sounds delicious, man. I can't wait. Bring some to HBC.
Yeah, I don't think it'll be left by then. This is going to be a quick one to go. But well, I mean, looking at these experiments, I know that we've got a lot more kind of research to do when it comes to sugar additions in beer. But have these influenced your approach to using sugar? It sounds like Malcolm kind of is moving away from staggered sugar additions at this point, just because in his experience and also his experiment didn't seem to matter too much. What about you?
So I've brewed 2 beers with sugar since this experiment ran, and I have added both of them to the boil. I'm ultimately making these beers around 1085, and I'm usually not adding it to too much more. And with the fact like that, I'm pitching a lot of yeast, and I'm pitching I've got vitality starters as well. I'm usually using oxygen for something that's this high. I don't think it's, right. I'm not having a problem. It's way easier for me just to add it to the boil. Like I said earlier, I'm not ready to totally discount it. And I think there's certainly circumstances and maybe even specific yeasts, like some people have speculated, where you do want to do this during fermentation or after fermentation. But for the beers I've been brewing, I've been putting it all in the boil.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, one thing that I forget who told me this, and I wish I could give them credit, but you had mentioned like there's the density of certain sugars, especially syrups, especially like honey, stuff like that. If you're adding that during during fermentation as opposed to during the boil, and I get, again, we have experimentation to do with this stuff, but there's some argument that adding something like honey during the boil is going to change the character and the flavors of that, as opposed to if you just add fresh honey directly to your fermentation, whatever it is. Someone was telling me though that they were fermenting in a glass carboy, and they just dumped in like 4 pounds of honey into a beer at high Kreuzen. So they saw this honey basically just dwindle down into the bottom of the carboy, and it just, they weren't about ready to shake it up or stick a spoon in there or anything. They came back like 4 days later, and that honey was gone. The yeast will get to it. It will ferment those sugars, and so it's not. I actually don't think it's anything to worry about if you're adding sugars and they end up at the bottom of the carboy. It's going to get fermented, at least based on what I've heard. As for me, though, personally, I honestly just don't brew with sugar enough to have this impact my thinking in any way whatsoever. If I am going to, just like I did with this Belgian blonde ale, I'm tossing it all in during the boil just so I don't have to, open up my fermenter 5 times throughout the fermentation process. So, well, Matt, you have anything else on sugar additions in beer?
Man, I really quickly want to touch one of the experiments I would love to see based off of what you just said is testing the same sugar addition in the boil, and then see if we can figure out some way to find out, like, does boiling a sugar get rid of some of those more volatile aromatics and some of those more volatile compounds? You've got me on the hook on that one. I'm pretty excited about that idea, but other than that, no.
And we'll be doing more experiments on it, and of course there will be more episodes on this topic to follow. Well, to read more about the experiments we did discuss in this episode and all of the other wacky stuff we're up to, you can head over to brewlosophy.com. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it suits my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no